Welcome to School of Shastrartha's YouTube channel. This is the second episode in a series called Vichāranā. For this episode, we hosted Professor Nilanjan Bhowmick, who is an assistant professor at Faculty of Arts, Delhi University. I sat down with him while Shivai was present behind the camera, and we discussed a number of things. First, we started the conversation off by discussing the Analytic Continental Divide, which Nilanjan sir thought is not quite as prevalent and is not quite as concrete as we think it is. Then we discussed Frege and his project of logicism, and we concluded the conversation by discussing early Wittgenstein and his last proposition, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, in the perhaps religious connotations of it. I've had the pleasure to engage with Professor Bhowmick earlier as well, before this conversation took place, and as those conversations and those engagements went, this one was incredibly and as interesting. The episode with Professor Bhowmick is coming up right now. I hope you enjoy. Well, sir, so we stopped your CV before coming here, right, as we discussed, and there was something very interesting there, and in fact I even had one more question to ask about, which was, you did your bachelor's in journalism, right? So that's very interesting. That's one thing. The second thing is, you do your master's, and ideally a person would just, do their PhD, become a professor of some sort, but you disappeared. You're off the planet for 10, 12 years, and then you come back and you start teaching in Stephen. So what's up with that?
So yeah, I guess there are two questions here. One is what's going on with this journalism thing, and the second one is what happened after 98.
And especially because you said that you were interested in philosophy always, so it's disorienting. Why journalism?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's actually a very good question, because why didn't I get into philosophy straight away? And I should have. So when I was in school, I'll just go back to school, I guess. By some mistake, I read Plato's Republic, and I was very influenced by it. So I was around in class 11, or maybe stepping into class 12. And as you are in class 11 and 12, you tend to start losing interest in what's going on in school, right? You're more interested in what's happening around you, what's happening in the world, what books are you reading, that kind of thing. So I was, since I was a science student, I was doing lots of maths, trying to figure out what's going on. And just by mistake, I read Plato's Republic, then I joined a library, and I started reading other books in philosophy.
I see.
So, but I joined the Delhi Public Library.
This was in which standard exactly?
I was in 11th at that time.
I see.
So I didn't read too many books before that actually. So I would read, simple things like detective novels and whatever, Sherlock Holmes, stuff like that. It was pretty interesting. Or Tintin or something, what every kid reads. So by the time I got into 11th, I suddenly discovered this book, Plato's Republic, and I do remember reading James's Varieties of Religious Experience. That was a great book to read, fantastic book to read. So I got very interested in philosophy, but I was not very organized in some sense in figuring out, okay, this is what I want to do. So that kind of thought never occurred to me. So I was intensely and deeply against getting into engineering or being driven into being a doctor or something like that. And I was also very fortunate that nobody really pressed me into becoming anything. So that was a very good thing about the way I was growing up. Nobody really asked me to read this or read that, or they just left me free. So I was just reading whatever I wanted. So once I was through school, of course the question arises, what are you going to do? So I had no real interest in education once you had left school. I think that should be the ideal reaction to leaving school, that you just lose interest in education, because that's the whole point of school. So I was very determined that I need to avoid this educational system. So what can you possibly do to avoid the system? So, well, you should take a subject which allows you enough freedom to read whatever you wish. That's what I wanted to do, be close to a library and read lots of stuff. That's what I really wanted to do. So I thought, well, maybe I can take English literature. That interested me. Everyone reads Shakespeare and Jane Austen or what. So I had read all that stuff when I was in school. So I had read a lot of Dickens, as a matter of fact. So Dickens was this big hero for me. So I thought, let me join English literature. So I went to a college and I joined there, and of course I had filled some science thing, but thankfully my percentage wasn't enough, so I didn't get it. So otherwise I would have made an even bigger mistake by getting there. So I got into English literature. Then somebody told me, there is this course in Delhi College of Arts and Commerce, it's on journalism, it's very interesting. So I used to read magazines and newspapers. Everyone used to do that at that time. So in those days we had Illustrated Weekly of India and Hindustan Times, Indian Nation, all these big newspapers always coming in. So that's the way television was not the main source of news, it was really newspapers and journals and magazines.
Yes.
So India Today, Outlook, all these magazines were always outside. So it was like wonderful to have access to them. So I thought, I was confident about my style of writing. So I said, let's get into a journalism course. It won't really force me to read what I don't want to read. And I can have a freedom of time. I will just read whatever I wish to read. So that's what I really did when I got into college. I didn't really bother too much about what was being taught. I just went to that's the first thing I did. I went to the library, got 4 cards made. Then I got into other libraries as well, and I sort of started just reading all the stuff that I was getting from these libraries. So that explains those 3 years that I spent in journalism. Then there is a 1-year break, as a matter of fact. So I was slightly unwell, I think, by the time I was ending the journalism thing, and I wasn't very sure what to do. So I was looking for a job, and I think I got some job somewhere in some very small place in some journals. I was in a magazine, so I was just writing some stuff here and there, editing, sub-editing, that kind of stuff. And then I was pretty unhappy with that. I said, look, I'm getting more and more and more into reading philosophy, so I really need to do philosophy. So I thought I would do a BA Honours in philosophy. I'll just go back again to the beginning. This is one of those things that all philosophers have, I think, that they always want to go back to the beginning. So, practically go back to school and start again from nursery. So, I thought, okay, let's start with another BA Honours. So, I had already done a graduation. So, but then my friends told me, no, why are you doing BA Honours? Do an MA. So, they had an entrance exam. So, I prepared for it. I was very afraid of taking the MA exam. So, that's probably one of the first times I visited North Campus. I had never been to North Campus. I'm a fairly lazy person. I don't really go around too much. So I saw North Campus. I was not very impressed, and I still am not. So I came to North Campus, gave the exam, then I got into MA. And so I studied and did whatever, and I finally, those 2 years are done. Then I got into an MPhil. So by that time,
were you staying in Delhi itself? Or
I was staying in Delhi itself. Yeah, that's right. I used to stay in RK Puram, so I had to travel a long time, get to MA. But my MA was mostly in South Campus, which is again good, because South Campus was a beautiful campus, but separate from the large academic setup of the North Campus. So most of the teachers teaching here, they would go there occasionally and teach there. So I was exposed to them, not like right through the week, but like they would just come and explain stuff and then go away. So and South Campus library was again very, very good. So I was very fortunate to be very close to a library that practically nobody was using. So it was great for me. I had a field run basically. Just go to the library, just read stuff. It was amazing. Fantastic reading room, all these arrangements were there, hundreds of books. So great. And the library was really very good, the philosophy library there. So and I hope it still is. I have not had time to revisit it. I would really like to see that library again, because that's where I grew up in a sense. So I read all these books again, and I did reasonably well in MA. And then I started developing an interest in what is usually described as analytic philosophy, and I guess we'll come back to this later. Yes. So then I did an MPhil. It is really during the MPhil that I got introduced to ideas that actually I may have been interested in for a very long time, but it was a subconscious interest. So because it was a subconscious interest, I was not very sure what was going on in my mind, but Professor Mukherjee, who was here, he gave a seminar on Chomskyan linguistics, and I took that seminar, and I was introduced to all kinds of ideas that I kind of agreed with. And I also read a fair amount of philosophy of language at that time. So I actually came to philosophy of language from a very different perspective. People do philosophy of language and maybe they do a little bit of linguistics. So I did a lot of linguistics, then I came to philosophy of language. It's just the reverse. So then of course 1998 hits, I finished my MPhil. My MPhil was on whether and what shape semantics should take within a generative grammar. This is like, it is by hindsight that I figured out that this is too large a topic for a student. But anyway, it's something for you think over a lifetime, I guess. It's not like something you do in 6 months. So, but it's something I still think about. So, come 1998, I have got my MPhil degree and I'm looking around for a job. I don't get a job. So, my people who I live with, my mother, she was telling me that, look, you need to get a job and all this, keep body and soul together. So I thought, well, what's the nearest possible exam that I can give? What's the exam that I can give easily? So the civil service exam was there. I had no idea that people actually went to coaching classes and prepared for it, and spent years preparing. I had no such idea in my head. I had no information about this. So, but that's the way I like approaching certain things, with zero information. So that's the style of life that is least stressful. So I gave that exam, I cleared it. I still was not interested in joining it, but because nothing in the civil service really agrees with my political inclinations. I am not very interested in serving the government or serving anybody actually. So, but anyway, it was a job. I did it from 9 to 5 for about 7 or 8 years. And then one day I decided that, look, I'm just interested in philosophy, let's get out of this thing and just do philosophy. So I applied abroad and I got an admission in University of Connecticut, and I went and did a PhD there. Then I came back and started teaching in Delhi University. So first I joined St. Stephen's, and then I got an opportunity in Faculty of Arts. So that gap that you were looking at is that specific gap when I was not getting a job after MPhil in philosophy in academics. And so I spent some time outside the planet, as you said, and which is true in a sense. You sort of become a stranger to yourself. I mean, you're doing something that you really don't want to do. I mean, there's nothing really great that you're doing there. So it's just that you're spending time in an office, sitting in a chair, so and pushing files around. So that explains the hiatus. But I kept reading philosophy as I was there in the services. So I just kept reading the stuff, and not very regularly, but I read more after 3 years in the service. The first 3 years, a lot of work is going on. Although it's just meaningless work, but whatever, there's work. So after I got a little bit more free time, I started reading up and buying lots of books. So that's the explanation of the hiatus in between.
So you say meaningless work, but I'm pretty sure, I mean, in some sense, even that meaningless work does amount to something, one droplet of water in a big ocean. Do you think it is meaningless because you like to do things which have a personal sense of meaning? Is that why you call it meaningless, or do you truly think that it was just meaningless?
It's in a sense it doesn't really agree with if anything really happens in the civil services, it's not terribly apparent. So I mean, what change? If you have to look at it statistically, I guess. So I am a great believer in statistics. So you have to look at it statistically. What has it done for the country such that you can see, okay, here are the big things that are happening in the country because of the services? Well, the answer is it's almost it can't be seen. What's really going on that they are doing such that you can actually see it and really believe yourself that this is really worth it? Well, in my opinion, nothing much can be seen. So I'm not very sure what's going on in it, but it's a kind of by inertia things happen. So I think the country is just going through a process where we are finding it very hard to change ourselves from the setting that we had. So it's very easy to change the name of a road and name one road as A and another as B or something. That's pretty easy to do. But it's very hard to take decisions like, we don't really need this service, we can do it with something else. So other countries have different systems. I mean, how come they are running and we are functioning in this strange way? So we need to sort of look at other countries, look at other forms of administration and governance, and then just see what we can do about it. It does not seem very obvious to me that the colonial administration, the way it used to run, is the same way that we should be running things. So that seems to be a very wrong idea.
It seems you had been a lifelong reader even before you gave the civil services examinations. Do you think it helped you? Because the way you talk about it, you did not seem very serious about it,
Oh yeah, no, I was not serious at all.
Yes.
But I just read the books and that's about it. I think it's very minimal intelligence is needed to crack these exams really. So in my opinion, the exam is a totally mediocre exam set by mediocre people. So that's just how it is. So if you are a sufficiently mediocre person with very minimal intelligence, you should be able to crack it pretty easily.
But say you certainly were not a person with minimal intelligence, were you? Because you were reading books ever since you could read. Most people do not do that. So it seems really your declaration about the lack of merit of the examinations is only a symptom of your merit.
No, that's not really true. I mean, we have to look at it's just looking at the sample. So let's see.
It's like the beautiful person saying, well, beauty does not matter, right? Well, they are beautiful, so of course they are going to say that beauty does not matter.
No, it's not like that. You have to look at the sampling thing actually. So if you take a very large range of people who are passing the exams, then you kind of come to realize that you don't really need to be a reader or anything like that to pass the exam.
Yes,
so if you take a large sample, then I am not really the best example to look at.
And so, how was your experience in the States doing your PhD?
Well, that's nothing. I mean, you just study, and their system is a bit different. So here we write exams, there you write papers. So that's one thing. And so I was already used to reading for hours and hours. So it was not much of it was not very difficult for me. And I like reading philosophy. I can read it for hours and hours. So I have a tremendous appetite for the subject, I guess. Maybe that's a bad thing, but I have an appetite for it. So there is a point after which I can't read other subjects unless I have read some philosophy in between. So that's there. I mean, I just cannot live without the subject. So it was not very hard for me really.
But did the intellectual atmosphere of the place help?
Oh yes, because they gave all these courses that have a certain contemporary flair to them, a contemporary relevance to them, and so therefore you learn things that are happening in the world in philosophy right now, and so that helps you. Maybe it doesn't help you much, but yeah, it does help you to figure out that this stuff is what is going on. Plus, I think students themselves bring in a fair amount of information, and that's what really matters. It's not really teachers who do much in universities, it's really the students who shape the future. This is what I believe actually. Teachers have a way of presenting their information, and that's just about it really. So, but it's the student who takes that information and then takes it forward. And then the student gets to be a teacher maybe, and then the inertia starts. And so then again some new student comes in, they take the subject forward. So that's just how it happens. It's a kind of start and stop and start and stop process. So I mean, doing a PhD is always very stressful for anybody. Doesn't really matter who it is. But it's because there is so much material today to read. So even in philosophy, so it's not like there's just one person you can read and you can forget about everybody else.
Yes.
There are any number of good philosophers, all very well trained in the subject, and so you have to read all of them, understand them, figure out what they are saying. So these are things that everyone has to do in any case. It's a kind of just part of training, really, nothing else.
But of course, we cannot read everyone, right?
No, you can't read everyone.
And if we cannot read everyone, then there is a sense of dread. You know, I'm not reading this person, so say I'm a continental philosopher, I'm a student of continental philosophy, I'm not reading analytic philosophy. Now, I can either admit to the fact that they might have something very profound that I'm missing to this big picture, or the easy way out, which is also the common way out of this, is, well, they are just speaking nonsense, right? The continental philosophers are speaking the truth, they are speaking nonsense. So everything that in some sense I cannot read, and in a way you can also say that our readings are guided by this notion of what is sense and what is nonsense, right? If I think that something is nonsense, does not make sense to me, then I would not even read it. But it seems either I can admit that there is always something that I'm going to miss out on, there is going to be this constant dread, which as a student you might have experienced it as well. I don't know, it might have only amplified as you age, because the horizons keep going. They keep receding in a way, but even as of now we feel, well, I mean, all right, I can see how this thing works to some extent, but it seems I'll never really get even a comprehensive picture of what could be. So two ways: either I say everything else is nonsense except whatever I am reading, or I'm just a fool.
Well, I know the reading should be just driven by curiosity, so we shouldn't really bother too much about whether something is in analytic or continental or whatever. Whatever serves my curiosity, wherever my curiosity is going, that's how I should read. We should not have all these biases in mind. The continental and analytic philosophers, they deal with the same topics. After all, Husserl had a long correspondence with Frege. So Frege is like the ultimate analytic philosopher, though he himself does not know that. And Husserl is like a very serious continental philosopher. But he does not know that. Husserl doesn't know he is a continental philosopher. Neither does Frege know he is an analytic philosopher. So these are just kind of, I don't know, I guess academia is full of this kind of stuff nowadays. But if you look at the people who founded these things, these movements, continental or analytic philosophy, they are not really aware of all this stuff. So they don't know that they are doing analytic philosophy or something. This is, I think, a classification brought in later by people who look back at the history of the subject, and then they start dividing.
Actually, it's interesting because I wish to come at this before we move on to philosophy of language and analytic philosophy specifically, which is as the 5th semester started, professors, I mean, it seems in the first semester, right? As a philosophy student, I don't know what your experiences have been, but in the first semester, for the first 15-20 days, every professor will come in, and with all due respect, of course, they'll just say something like, what is philosophy? Philo and Sophia, love and wisdom, and then 15-20 interpretations of Philo and Sophia, right? And in the 5th semester, the only thing that they talk about for the 15-20 days that they teach is what is the difference between analytic and continental philosophy, right? So I understand this difference in a particular way, and judging by whatever you've said till now, I think you'll agree, but this is how I understand it, right? Then you can perhaps say what you think about it. There were certain philosophers on the European continental side who did philosophy, Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, and then further on Kant and Hegel and Fichte and all of these personalities. Then on the British Isles, a few certain gentlemen were like, we don't like the way they philosophize, so we are going to develop a different tradition, or at least attempt to do so, right? And this was in the milieu of that turn towards language in early 20th century, right about that time. So it seems alright, there were certain original continental philosophers that was purely a geographical labeling.
Yeah, that's right.
And then the analytical philosophers were not in a way, geographically tied together, but rather in opposition to whatever was continental philosophy. And then further on, as scholarly works began to emerge out of these two sets of traditions. Whatever concerned with the continental philosophers, be it on the British Isles or on the continental Europe, started to be called continental philosophy, and whatever deals with the literature on the analytical side is analytic philosophy. I think it's just as simple as that, but also complicated in a way, because it has two things: historicity as well as a certain geographical aspect. Do you think this understanding of the divide is apt, or is there something that one should add to this?
There is this unfortunate tendency in academia to think that there is some very great and major divide between analytic and continental philosophy. But if you go back to the beginnings and the origins of what's going on, really the concerns are very similar. So you look at Husserl, for instance. Well, he's writing about, if you look at the titles of his books, so he said logical investigations. That's about as good a title as you can get in analytic philosophy. But he's like the key continental philosopher. So if you look at the concerns of continental philosophers, they're very similar to analytic philosophers. The topics that they are discussing are pretty much the same. They may discuss it in a language which is a bit different or a bit more obscure, but analytic philosophers can also be found who are pretty obscure. So a lot of current analytic philosophy, let us say current metaphysics. Now there are many analytic philosophers who say that they find it obscure. So within analytic philosophy itself, there is this odd divide that there is a certain amount of metaphysics going on which they find obscure. So for these people to claim that continental philosophy is especially obscure, or they don't understand what is going on, that's not much to say really. I mean, continental philosophy has pretty much the same concerns as analytic philosophy. They are all answering the same questions. So continental philosophers may not take interest in certain questions like, let's say, personal identity or something, and analytic philosophers may take some interest in certain questions like personal identity. But the concerns are very similar. The approaches of answering the questions may be different, which is a good thing. You need different approaches to answer the same questions. So this divide seems to be a very artificial kind of divide. It's like a political divide really. It has no real, there's no basis in reality for this divide. Except maybe that in academic disciplines, when we teach a subject, if you're teaching John Searle, then you will not be teaching Derrida in the same course. Or if you are teaching Saul Kripke, you will not be teaching Foucault in the same course. But that does not mean that Foucault is irrelevant to the entire discipline of analytic philosophy, or that Kripke is totally irrelevant to what continental philosophers are doing. That's not how we should approach it. I guess there is also this issue of there is this vast amount of material. So once you get into the subject, then you're just reading a particular kind of material. So you don't want to jump out of that material and start reading something happening in some corner in the US. So that kind of thing is also there. I guess it's just a question of this divide really is an artificial divide, and no great research has been done to suggest that there is some real issue in this divide, as if something really big is going on. And if there were really such a thing like this, then there would be massive research on this. that there is a major division between two kinds of philosophical activity. But I have not seen any massive research on this. That seems to suggest straight away that professional philosophers don't really think there is any great divide like this. It's just that the way they approach these questions are different, that's all. So historical antecedents of current continental philosophy will be people in France and Germany, somebody will be reading Gadamer. But Gadamer can be read very easily by analytic philosophers as well. Just like Husserl is somebody that analytic philosophers read. So, and they read with substantial interest because Husserl has the same interest. Husserl has the interest in philosophy of mathematics, just like Frege. So, and this interest has always been there in analytic philosophy. So, we can't just simply say that nobody is going to read continental philosophy or something. That's not how it is. I mean, it's just, there is some issue regarding this postmodernist outlook, and the analytic philosophers don't particularly like it. But that issue is a bit different. I mean, the postmodernist outlook tends to think that it appears that this is the case. It's kind of hard to pin down what they think. But they seem to think that there is some kind of social aspect involved in science, and there's some. Actually, he was saying this, I think, just before we started talking on video, that there is this. Social power relations are really responsible for the transmission of knowledge, and that's what knowledge really is. Mm-hmm. So I agree with the idea that what gets transmitted, what gets taught in schools and universities, a lot depends on who is in power, who determines this. So somebody who is in power determines what is studied in history. Somebody who is in power determines what is studied in philosophy or in economics. So why do you study game theory in economics? What is the point of studying that? Well, somebody in power decides this is the right thing to study. Why don't you spend 2 years studying Arthashastra in Kautilya's Arthashastra in economics classes? Well, you don't do it because somebody in power thinks, that's just not the right thing to do. We should do game theory or, something else, behavioral economics. We need to do a lot of mathematics in economics. We need to do econometrics. So all that's not part of Arthashastra. So they say, look, we either train people in the modern way in which things are done, or we just don't train them. So the best decision to take is to train them. Mm-hmm. That's a decision taken by people who are ostensibly in power. And so whether it's a right or wrong decision, it seems to be the right decision certainly. So this is really, I agree with the idea that of course knowledge is, what is transmitted to you as knowledge comes from some power source, that is true. But that doesn't mean that is not knowledge. It doesn't mean that thing is not true. So if somebody who is an astronomer says that the age of the universe as we determine it from cosmic microwave background radiation is this much, it is this number, 13.8 billion years. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it's coming from an astronomer who maybe is sitting in England, therefore is a power source of some kind. Maybe if the same thing was said by somebody,
subject
that's right. So yeah, so some guy who is sitting as a power source in say MIT or something, he says this. Okay, that we take it more seriously than that somebody says it in sitting in Nainital. But yeah, I mean ultimately, what is true is what's going to matter. And so it doesn't mean that if somebody is saying something from somewhere, therefore by the definition that is true. We have to figure out whether it is true or not. So it is true, knowledge is transferred by those who are in power, but that doesn't mean that thing is not knowledge. I think postmodernists tend to think that therefore knowledge is relative to power structures. That step is wrong. It is correct to say that knowledge is transmitted by those who are in power, but from there to think that therefore knowledge is relative to power structures, that step is wrong. Knowledge is not relative to power structures. The transmission of knowledge is relative to power structures. Yes, that's correct.
So, but if I don't exactly know the postmodernist. I mean, this is the Foucauldian argument. I think Foucault largely articulated this in his works. But say, all right, so you are agreeing in a way that knowledge is mediated by these power structures.
Yeah, that's true.
But then, if you are to disagree, then and say, well, for me to decide what knowledge is proper knowledge, or I could say what knowledge is true, but technically, well, if knowledge is not true, then it is not knowledge in the first place. So, what knowledge is proper knowledge and what knowledge is not proper knowledge? If it is on me to decide this, and I can do this, in some way you are establishing the independence of the knower, the subject to these power structures, as if I am this isolated entity and I myself am not mediated through these power structures. It's like, well, all right, let's think of an example. Domestic violence, right? So ideally, bad men should be the ones who propound domestic violence. Yes, we should beat our wives if they do not obey us, something like that. But what is interesting is, why are the women, the older women in the same households, thinking the same way? They're like, oh yes, of course, if you do not listen to your husband, of course he's going to beat you. What's wrong there? So it's this weird thing where, well, wait a minute, this woman, who is a woman, right, this individual thing who can decide right and wrong, it's a bad thing to beat a woman, is now supporting the very thing that is against her or was against her at some point in time. So it tells us that this will we have, or let's just say the sense we have of deciphering falsity from truth, if this is even the right vocabulary to use, it is also within that power structure, and then it becomes very tricky, right? It's like Descartes. I cannot even know if I am. I mean, of course, he establishes that, but say if I cannot know it, then there is really nothing that I can have a grasp on, a claim on. Oh, this is the truth. So then, how would you respond to that? Because then it seems the moment you agree with that first premise, which is all right, everything is mediated by power, you cannot say, well, I am the isolated divine thing, judging facts from fiction. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that worry is definitely true, that our wills are largely determined by the set of beliefs that are contained in society. So that is true, and you are very right. Some women don't necessarily agree with other women who are suffering, they agree with the men who are making those women suffer. So that's very true. But it's just because these women are in the same power structures. So that's the basic idea. I mean, if they were suffering, they would protest. But they are not suffering. So they are probably getting some benefit from this suffering. So therefore, they just participate in the power structure. It's very difficult to go against a power structure, because then you have to suffer a great deal. So it's very difficult to do that. That's probably one of the main reasons why we thought of go along with the flow, so to speak. But some human beings tend to go against the flow, and progress tends to often fall on these suffering shoulders. But I don't think that it is true that, there is a power structure, it is so powerful that we can never escape it. That's not quite true. And of course, and it is also not true that if I have escaped it, therefore I have some divine entity inside me or anything. Nothing like that is there. Human beings tend to have different opinions, and sometimes some people have a strong will enough to go against the general herd instinct. So that's just simple history, really. There's really no great mystery about all this stuff. We tend to think it is very mysterious and strange and whatever. There's really nothing great about it. I mean, these are very simple, common-sensical things. Some people just don't agree with what's going on, and many people don't agree, but not everyone is successful enough to pass on their disagreement. And these disagreements then again become power structures, and they get passed on, and then again somebody disagrees with it. So it's a very slow process of progress. So that it happens. So, but it's just commonsensical stuff, really.
Coming back to this analytic continental divide, before we move on, you said that there's not, it seems to you that there is not really a divide, right?
No, I don't think so.
But, and that is true, again, let me not say but, it's an instinctive thing that we use the word but, and then it makes us disagree, where there is not real disagreement at all, maybe. So I do not disagree with you really on the fact that, well, it is fuzzy enough for us to fail to recognize that there's a difference. That is certainly there. It's like if somehow the camera overlapped our faces in a way that our features were not distinguishable, right? I could still say that yes, there are two different people.
Yeah, that's right.
I cannot tell them apart, right? So they might as well be one person. But if we go to these specificities and we talk about, say, one thing, which is a tendency to, in continental philosophy, I've observed from whatever little readings I've done, it is to inquire into these power structures. First, of course, is to believe in it, because analytic philosophers do not seem to even have a vocabulary for it, so that means they do not even believe in it, right? So to inquire into these power structures, and most importantly, there is this reflexivity involved where the continental philosopher, or at least someone like, at least the great figures, because well, at least the great figures, they have this tendency to be reflexive, right? All right, I wish to know, but why do I wish to know? Is me trying to know something that I'm not doing for myself? So what's the classic image of recognition and interaction in, say, German idealism? It's not that I am this I and I'm isolated from everything and I can decide what I am. No, I am so much embedded in you, which is the other, that I cannot think of myself, my identity, I cannot articulate my identity independent to you. So it's like everything is interconnected, and that gives us room to think about these reflexive questions. Well, alright, I think that I like something. Say, I like this shirt, but in fact my mother bought me this shirt. I wanted to buy some other t-shirt, but it seems my mother knows me better what I wish to wear than myself, and she bought me this shirt, right? So in a way there's this tendency to doubt ourselves and this pursuit of knowledge, which is not present in analytic philosophy as such, because of which the discourse does not even seem to stop for a moment and ask, well, what are we doing exactly? I hope I made sense.
Oh, I mean, if you are speaking of the question, what are we doing exactly? So if you look at the last, well, this has been a dominant trend in analytic philosophy since about the early 20th century. So if you look at the birth of analytic philosophy, why is it born? Well, they ask themselves the question, what are we doing? And then they realize that they are deeply entrenched in an idealistic tradition in Britain, in Germany, and so they break away from this tradition. But there has been major concern about what philosophers are doing for the last about 30 years, I think. There has been huge work in meta-philosophy, largely concentrated in what we describe as analytic philosophy, as to what are our methods, what are we doing. So you will see an explosion of books on philosophical methodology, for instance. Where are they coming from? They are coming from analytic philosophers. So at least all the publications are coming from there. So this stuff is very intense in analytic philosophy today. They are deeply distressed by the idea that there is so much disagreement in philosophy. What are we supposed to do with all this disagreement? How do we understand this disagreement? Then they are also worried about what do we mean by progress in philosophy. Are we making progress in this subject? What do we mean by making progress in the subject? Do we need to make progress in the subject? Does the notion of progress as it applies to philosophy, does it apply to any other subject? So how do we calibrate progress in the subject? So it is quite odd to say that analytic philosophers are not interested, they are not being self-reflective. These are, as of now, for the last 30 years or so that I am aware of, analytic philosophers have been very deeply interested in and getting better and better results out of what is called meta-philosophy. So meta-philosophy is just asking the question, what are we doing in this subject? What are our methods? How are we different from science? So because philosophy shares some elements with science and also shares some elements with humanities. So philosophy sits somewhere in the middle. It's a very unusual subject that way. But it is deeply self-reflective. So they are asking this question very intensely. So again, if you go back to this very peculiar idea of a divide between continental and analytic, there is really no divide as such. Nobody's ever. There are some articles I have found, stray articles talking about this divide, but there is really nothing else. The same topics are being discussed. They are just discussed differently. If you read Sartre, for instance, he is a tremendously analytical philosopher, tremendously so. So I mean, he's always discussing this distinction and that distinction, and just tremendous analytical stuff is going on. So to say that there is some divide, there is no real divide. There may be some divide in method, maybe. So analytical philosophers are more interested in looking at language, and continental philosophers will be more interested in looking at experience, or looking at mediated experiences through very complicated concepts that they might have. So okay, that's fine, but to say that there is some general intense divide, both these traditions are born from Kant. So all the chaos and confusion we see in philosophy today comes from Kant. What are we supposed? I guess the question in philosophy is, what are you supposed to do with Kant? So I mean, where are you supposed to take this philosopher? Which direction should I take? So and I think that worry that Kant has introduced, that our categories are essentially related to experience, and they make sense only when you apply them to experience, and they don't make sense when you apply them to certain issues in philosophy. That worry has just been held through in philosophy for a very long time. I guess you can say that analytic philosophers don't, if there is one thing on which I find division, that is that analytic philosophers don't think too much about their historical connection with the Enlightenment, but Continental philosophers are very deeply aware of the correction of what they do with the Enlightenment. Whether they are anti-Enlightenment, pro-Enlightenment, whatever, that doesn't matter. The issue is that they are very deeply aware of a historical break that the Enlightenment brings. The analytical philosophers don't really worry about it because their attempt is to de-historicize themselves and discuss philosophical questions just as they should be discussed amongst people. Don't worry about where I am coming from, whether Berkeley said this or Hume said that. Don't worry about all this. Just do the stuff as it is. So, but I have very rich work in history of philosophy is done in analytic philosophy. Very, very rich work is done in meta-philosophy. So, amongst the top philosophers in the world who work in analytic philosophy, many of them are meta-philosophers. So, very good work has been done in here. But it is not work in which there is much agreement. But at least there is some work going on as to what are we doing in the subject. In what sense can we say that philosophy can progress? Because sciences are progressing. Every subject apparently is going somewhere. But philosophy is apparently not going somewhere. So this worry is there. What are we doing? What are our methods? Is there a deep crisis within analytic philosophy regarding methods? And whether we are the only ones suffering from the crisis, or is there somebody else who is also suffering from it? So all these issues are there, but these issues are there everywhere. I am sure continental philosophers are as well aware of it as analytic philosophers are. But the only division that I see between them is simply a division of their relationship to the Enlightenment. Analytic philosophers take it for granted, and continental philosophers don't take it for granted that the Enlightenment is right. That's, I guess, the only difference.
I think, yes, that is a fair resolution. I was not even consciously thinking of meta-philosophy as that reflexive process of thinking about, well, what exactly are we doing? You talk about progress in philosophy. How would you talk about progress in philosophy?
There are many ways to think about the progress in philosophy. So somebody can be very positive about it. They can say, look, we have had tremendous progress in the subject. So if you look at the history of the subject, okay, Plato and Aristotle, and Aristotle has much more to say than Plato, so there's some progress. We are beginning to understand things better. And you look at Hume and Berkeley and Locke, and some progress is going on, something is happening. What really happens in philosophy, if you think of progress, is really refinement of the argument. So we begin to realize that when we are beginning with the subject, there are hundreds of arguments in front of you regarding maybe the same subject, regarding some particular topic in philosophy, let's say causality or personal identity or the self or whatever. Hundreds of arguments are there. But as you keep making progress, you realize that all these hundreds of arguments are like only 5 arguments are left on which you really have to concentrate. So that's one way of looking at progress. Other people think that there is no progress, because some people think that all philosophy is simply writing footnotes to Plato. So I think Whitehead said that, and Whitehead knew enough philosophy. So I suppose it just depends on how you look at the history of the subject. So I do see progress in philosophy. It is not like I don't see any progress. It seems very surprising to me that somebody should say that there is no progress in the subject at all. We know a fair deal about logic today that we did not know in, let's say, Aristotle's period or medieval times. So we know much more about logic today. We have a far better idea of how to handle arguments in epistemology or anywhere else, just because of the richness of the number of alternatives that have come out. So we have made some progress regarding how do we answer a skeptic. There are many different answers running around. One can simply pick one's answer from all the alternatives that are present. So we have some progress. Progress is slow in philosophy, I guess, because the questions are much more difficult to answer. I am not pessimistic about the fact that there is no progress in this. I think there is progress, but it's a question of how much aware you are of what you are thinking. So of the arguments, and maybe there is no progress in personal identity, because it's just like people are just keep battling over what to do with this very strange and complex issue. But I don't believe that nobody will come along with a new idea that actually introduces something new in the subject. So philosophy has a way of surprising itself, just like almost any other subject actually. So there's just somebody who comes up with a completely new idea and it just revolutionizes the field. So you look at linguistics, for instance. So everybody used to do what is called field linguistics. People will go to some tribe and record everything, write out their grammar, stuff like that. But today linguistics is, sure, people do field linguistics, but they also do it in a Chomskyan way, so which is a very revolutionary and unusual way of doing the subject. But plus it brings in many philosophical ideas as well. So everybody thought that rationalism was just dead, for instance. So, but it came again back into consciousness with this revolution that Chomsky brings in, and which we today practice as cognitive science. So, that thing is again progress of some kind, but it's really a recovery of an old paradigm. So, sometimes in philosophy you regress a great deal. So, it seems to me that's what happens in the subject. There is a lot of progress, then there is a huge amount of regress. And then again the old progress is sort of, it comes into being again, and then we again get some progress. So it's the usual thing in every subject, I believe. It's just the same thing everywhere. There's just very little progress, then we tend to forget that progress, and then again the progressive stuff comes back. So, but it depends on how the subject is flowing in and out of academia, what's happening inside academia. So the main thing is the flow of talent in the subject. I think that's very important. So it seems to me that mathematics and physics, they have been very consistent in their flow of talent. So philosophy, I guess, is somewhat inconsistent in it, but things are going not badly. I mean, yeah, it is true. We don't know what our data is. We don't know what evidence means in philosophy. We don't know what it means to make progress in the subject. We don't know whether we have actually made progress in the subject by solving any problem. We don't know whether positivism actually was a regressive step or a progressive step. It's kind of hard to make all these decisions. But that does not mean that nothing is happening. I mean, it seems to me that something is happening and that we are pretty much in the same boat as any other subject. It's just that we are a little bit harder because we don't do experiments and we don't do other stuff that other scientists do. So we don't. Our subject is not heavily mathematized. And so therefore there is a lot of reliance on prose and writing the language properly and things like that, and so it's just that that's probably one reason why we think that no progress is taking place. But there are any number of good ideas running around, so that's also progress. It's not necessarily true that I have to make linear progress. Some good ideas, if they are running around and if I am aware of them, that's a good thing.
So we talked about progress, we have talked about analytic and the Continental Divide, we have talked about academic development. I think it would only be reasonable now to ask what are your interests, and we know this of course to some extent, but perhaps for the viewers, because again we stopped your CV, so there was an area of specialization and then areas of interest. But how would you talk about your interests in philosophy?
I would say I am interested in as of now and for the last few years. I have been interested in philosophy of language, philosophy of science, epistemology. So these are three areas in which I have taken substantial interest. I have always been interested in Greek philosophy, but it depends on how much time you get to read it. So these are the three areas in which I take a fair amount of interest, and of course some elements of meta-philosophy. I like meta-philosophy a lot. I guess anybody who's brought up on Wittgenstein, as I was, because I studied in Delhi University, and so Wittgenstein is always a big figure here. So one tends to like meta-philosophy more in that sense. So that's one of my major interests. So I guess to sum it up, I would say philosophy of language, philosophy of science. In philosophy of science, I am not interested in everything, but in the area of explanation. What is an explanation? And in epistemology, again, not interested in everything in the world, but certain areas of virtue epistemology. And then in meta-philosophy, again, I am not interested in practically every area of meta-philosophy, but in certain areas where it seems to me that maybe we can have some idea of what are we doing. That's always the biggest question to ask, what are we doing in the subject? So in meta-philosophy, that's a very key matter. So those are my interests largely. That's what I read in, as a matter of fact.
I think I would be interested in talking about Frege. And I mean, I originally wished to talk about a little bit of Frege and then a little bit of Wittgenstein, because not much, in fact, a little bit Wittgenstein, the blue and books even there. So just the introductory part. So this semester we are reading Frege, the article on thought, and I would be interested in understanding, and perhaps people would also like to understand what was Frege's entire project, and specifically a specific question to add to that, what was that polemic against, well, it's not really a polemic, but metaphorically speaking, against psychologism, because that seemed to be a very big thing at that time. So what's his project about? why is he arguing against psychologism? What is psychologism in the first place? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, difficult questions to answer because, well, let's take the question which is easier to answer, which is what is Frege's project? So Frege had just one single project in his entire lifetime, that is, he wanted to answer the question, how do we have knowledge of numbers? So I know 1 plus 1 is 2. So the question is, how do I know this? The number 1 is not available to me as, let's say, the laptop is something I can see, right? It's just something in front of me. I can know you, I can see you, I can talk to you, but I can't really interact with the number 1. This is what philosophers tend to think. The number 1 is abstract in some sense. So I can't really interact with it. I can't interact with the triangle, for instance. There is no triangle around, so I can't interact with it. So how do we have knowledge of these things? So that's Frege's project. Pretty much throughout his life, it seems that this is what he wants to ask. So he wrote this book called Grundlagen der Arithmetik, in which he says that we need to know what do we mean by the number 1. If I don't know what do I mean by the number 1, then how can I possibly make any progress in arithmetic? And unless and until I can make progress in this idea of knowing what the number 1 is, how do I really understand arithmetic? I need to first have a clear idea, how do I come to know anything about the number 1? And what is the number 1? And once I get to know this, then I can make progress in arithmetic. And so that's the idea Frege has. I need to know, the Frege's mind is a very simple mind. He just goes back to the most basic question that you can ask. Frege, it's very unclear to me what his education was, but he must have studied some philosophy. He didn't study philosophy as like people do in universities today, very intensely and deeply and whatever.
But say at that time, I don't think philosophy was an intense field.
Oh, it was intense, but Frege was studying something else, I believe. I believe he studied mathematics and chemistry. He was, of course, a teacher of mathematics. Mm-hmm. So, but philosophy may have come to him through just the general German atmosphere, so to speak. So
yes,
that he would have read some history of philosophy, I guess.
Yes.
He may not have read Plato and Aristotle as people do intensely in universities, but he is reasonably well acquainted with the subject. Not acquainted in some scholarly sense, but he has some pretty decent idea about it. So Frege's project is a pretty simple one. Find out what is a number, find out what do we mean by these words like addition, multiplication, etc. Once we have found all this stuff out, then I can give a full foundation to mathematics. And his idea is that to give a foundation to mathematics is to reduce mathematical terminology into logical terminology. So once I do that, then the whole of mathematics is founded on logic. So this project is called logicism. And there are divisions within logicism as to how we are supposed to go about this project, how do we implement the project. So that's the answer to the question, what is Frege's project? It's a long story, and it's really not very clear to me exactly how things are supposed to go in this. Frege is a scholarly project of some kind. Mm-hmm. You'll have to spend your whole life studying it, and he's worth studying. So I think the second question was about
his arguments against psychologism. And
that's right. Frege is actually very famous for this, his arguments against psychologism. But Frege's main idea is, if you look at his introduction to Grundlagen der Arithmetik, the foundations of arithmetic, I should say this is one of the very best books written in philosophy. Mm-hmm. So if you want to read any book that inspires you to do philosophy, you should read Grundlagen der Arithmetik. There is a very nice translation by J.L. Austin. So why does Frege not like psychologism? I guess psychologism is just the idea that roughly the idea is that to understand anything, we need to understand how that understanding took shape in human psychology. So if I want to understand what is the number 1, I need to understand what idea you have of the number 1. There is some idea in my head of the number 1 or the number 2 or the number 3. I have some idea in my head. So this is what the number 1 means. It means the idea in your head. So this is what Frege thinks is a very grave mistake. He thinks that I cannot take every subject that is there and reduce it to just psychology of human beings. He says this is just a wrong way to think about things. So he has a very nice example somewhere which I don't remember exactly, but the flavor of the example is that if I am thinking of the height of my brother, then I am not thinking of the idea of the height of my brother, I am thinking of the height of my brother. Or if I am thinking of my son's courage, or my son's doctoral dissertation, then I am thinking of my son's doctoral dissertation. I am not thinking of the idea of my son's doctoral dissertation. or if I am thinking how big the moon is. I think that's an example he gives. I am not thinking about how big the idea of the moon is inside my head. That's not what I am thinking. I am thinking how big the moon is compared to the earth. When I say the earth is larger than the moon, this is, I think, an argument straight from Frege. When I say the earth is larger than the moon, I am not saying the idea of the earth is bigger in my head than the idea of the moon. That's not what I am saying. I am not comparing sizes of ideas. I am actually saying something objective about the world. So Frege is very intensely devoted to the sense of objectivity. He says a lot about it actually in the Grundlagen. So he's deeply against, he's not against psychology as a subject. He is against unrestricted application of psychology to every subject possible. You can't say that Julius Caesar is just an idea in my head, or that number 1 is an idea in my head, or Akbar is an idea in my head. Yeah, it is true, I do have ideas about these things, but that doesn't mean that that thing is reducible to the idea itself. So he is opposed to this psychologistic, idealistic kind of views of or experiential views of a subject. So he's not opposed to psychology per se. He's opposed to unrestricted application of psychology to every other discipline. So reduce every discipline to psychology. That thing is deeply against, because then he thinks all objectivity is lost, completely lost. Then 1 plus 1 is not 2 for one person. For another person with a different psychology, with different ideas in his head, it will be something else, maybe it's fine. But then we can never settle these disputes. And he says this is just absurd. For everybody 1 plus 1 is 2. And the answer to the question why it is 2 can't come from my psychology. He makes a distinction between the source of a truth and the ground of a truth. And he says it is true that mathematics, the source of mathematics, it is true, it comes from my psychology. I think about mathematics. I wonder about the questions of mathematics. I think what is the number 1. My psychology grasps the answer to the question what is the number 1. But that does not mean that the ground of mathematics is your psychology. The source of physics is your psychology. You obviously think about black holes and stars and what you are thinking about it, it's your psychology. But that doesn't mean that the ground of physics is your psychology. The ground of a thing and the source of a thing are two different things. These two things should not be confused with each other.
So the naive question here perhaps, which is, you say that Frege did not want to reduce all of these other disciplines, all of these other inquiries to psychology. But isn't, I mean, if you were to think of it algebraically, so that we do not have our prejudices here, right? All the disciplines reduced to one discipline. This is a nice algebraic way of putting it, right? But the same thing Frege does then with logic, doesn't he? I mean, people, tell me if I'm wrong, thought that everything is essentially mathematics or some extension of it, all the other inquiries, and then he's reducing the source of all other inquiries to one single inquiry, which is logic. So he's somewhat in some way doing the same thing, isn't he?
Frege is not saying that everything is mathematics. So he just says, look, mathematics is one discipline. There are many other disciplines. So theology is there, metaphysics is there. He doesn't think that they are related to mathematics. They are doing whatever they are doing. All his interest is in reducing mathematics to logic.
But
he's not interested in reducing psychology to mathematics or something. If some discipline can't be treated mathematically, he's fine with that. There's nothing wrong with that.
But then again, maybe I don't understand at this point, why exactly do we need to reduce mathematics to logic? I mean, of course, you said that if I do not, well, there's a number 1, number 2, number 3, and I'm doing all of these wonderful things with these numbers. I'm concocting differential equations and then, calculating the velocity of black holes and whatnot. And I do not know what these numbers are. But it's like, well, how is that really important, substantially important? Because even though, so it's like that little story of a caterpillar, right? A dancing caterpillar. She used to dance very gloriously, and then one day there was this, I don't know, an ant, right? And this ant was very jealous of this centipede, like how does she dance so well? So it goes up to her, and the ant is like, well, dear centipede, you dance so well. You know, when you pull up or do that flick with your 67th leg at this particular point of time, it's so nice. And then so what happens is, the next time this the centipede dances, it becomes conscious. It's like, well, what exactly am I doing at what point of time? And then it cannot dance any longer. So it's like the very inquiry into something destroys that thing. So what is the point then, in some sense, and this might be an anti-foundationalist line of inquiry, what is the point of trying to know what is the number one or not, what is the number two, and not just do useful things with it?
Yeah, actually Frege connected these two things. So he said that when we give the foundation of anything, it should be connected to the use of the thing.
I see.
He actually he puts this as a constraint. Somewhere in his book Grundlagen, he is criticizing Newton. And he says, well, if you look at Newton's theory, Newton thinks numbers are magnitudes or something. So he says that all this is fine, but how do people use this thing? He says that whatever theory I give, it's got to be useful to people. Every human being uses numbers. I buy 5 apples in the market. I say this is 1 kilo, not 2 kilos. That's 3 pounds, not 4 pounds. So he says that every human being, however unlettered that this person may be, they use numerical concepts all the time. So the answer to the question that we give as to what is a number should be such that it makes the use of those concepts not remote or alien or strange. It should be perfectly commonsensical that these people use these concepts easily. So there should be some connection between use and foundation. That's very important. However, you asked a question that's actually a very difficult question to answer. Why should I give a foundation to mathematics? Frege, I believe, gives a reason saying that firstly, it's very strange that mathematics, which is one of the most disciplined subjects in the world, is still unaware of the fact of the most simplest thing that we can ask of mathematics. So if you ask a mathematician, they do so many things. Number theory, it takes a lot of work to master number theory, years and years and years of work, and you will come up with one theorem. So Frege says, but all that is fine, but when we ask the mathematician, what is a number? Apparently there are just different answers coming from different mathematicians. He says that's really strange. That makes no sense. How can a subject which is so objective, so disciplined, so difficult to do, where people struggle and there's so much genius involved in the subject, how is it possible that at the most basic level it is so hopeless? So the reason why I want to give a foundation to mathematics is simply because the foundation is lacking. It seems as if a discipline which is so disciplined, which takes so much effort to learn, there is no point in doing this because the answer to the most basic question of mathematics seems to be completely relative. Different mathematicians have different answers to the question, what is a number? He says he finds this situation to be extremely embarrassing. Frege says that it is very embarrassing that mathematicians sometimes say, oh, number nothing, it's just an idea in my head, or it is an idea in somebody's head. So he says, how is this possible? This whole subject depends upon your knowing what a number is, or what a line is, or what a point is. So how can you be unsure what these things are, and you are building an entire edifice or edifice of knowledge on this? How is that possible? So he says that we must reduce it to something so simple that yes, now we can understand this is what a number is, and then we build on that, and the entire structure of mathematics can be built on it. This will lead to a certain amount of certainty regarding the subject. Otherwise, the subject is nothing really. There's really nothing going on in the subject. Most basic things are so unclear to you.
There is no reason for someone who does not take it seriously to take it seriously.
Yeah, that's right.
People who are doing mathematics, they will continue to do mathematics.
Yeah, that's right.
But how do I convince someone who does not like mathematics?
That's
This
right.
is why it is important. So I suppose he does this by utilizing set theory, right? That is how set theory came about.
Yes, that's right. He uses the notion of the extension of a concept. So, the extension of a concept is, if you say the extension of the concept of man, so all the men will fall into it. The extension of the concept of human beings, all the human beings will fall into that extension. So he uses, so in a sense that is true, yeah, that's right.
It's
a set basically.
Yes, but it's like, I'm forgetting completely how he does this because I did not even refer to the primary source. I just watched a fun video about this. It's like when really the number 1 or something like that, or number 0 is supposed to be an empty set, and then all the other numbers are derived out of these empty sets, but empty sets within bigger sets, and that is how he derives number.
Yeah, that's right. I think he says the number 1 is the set which is not identical to the number 0 or something, or the set.
Yes, and the number 0 is just happens to be a cardinal set, right? So it's like when we're defining numbers which are substantial by something that is non-substantial, which is interesting.
It's not non-substantial, it's just that's the way the definition goes, that's all.
And apparently, now of course, to go into detail would probably...
So the number 0 is the set of things which are not identical to themselves. There is nothing which is not identical to itself. So the number 0 is the set of things which is not identical to itself.
Interesting. I mean, it sure seems like a very clever definition.
Yeah, it's a very nice.
But it seems like Plato saying a man is a featherless biped, right? It's like it only takes a Diogenes to bring up a chicken and disprove this. It's like, well, yes, it's clever, but somehow it intuitively does not appeal to me. Why?
That is true, yes. I mean, there is a kind of intuitive, you feel a little uncomfortable when you read these things.
Unsatisfied almost.
Yeah, like, that's right. But that's okay. I mean, it's just, we have to get used to, Frege is a disciplined mind. So we have to get into that disciplined and sort of think in the way he's thinking. He's a really good mind. I mean, he can really teach you philosophy the way it should be done. At least in one way of thinking of the subject. But I should emphasize again that he is not in the analytic or continental tradition or anything like that. He is not interested in these things. But his discipline is something that one should try to emulate.
Now, about his the entirety of his project, of course, that would be very difficult to inquire into in a conversation of this sort. Maybe, I mean, sir, when would you be taking? I mean, what are the classes that you're taking this time?
I am teaching analytic philosophy, logic, and virtue epistemology this semester.
This semester. I hope we are free to take the classes.
Yeah, of course. I mean, anybody can come.
Right. So for that, maybe we should enroll in one of your courses. But skipping the part that comes in between, let's go to the end, which is also interesting, right? I think Russell sent this letter to Frege.
Yeah, that's right.
He just had, I think, a few problems left to solve. The system is almost entirely done, and then Russell sends this letter, and Frege is completely devastated, and the system falls off in a way. Would that be correct?
Yeah, characterization? Because Russell showed that being a member of a set is it's a contradictory concept.
So I would like for you to talk about that in detail, because it is so interesting, right? As clever as Frege was defining zero as a set of things which are not identical to themselves, right? This entire thing of the set which does not contain itself, and how it produces a contradiction or a paradox depending upon how you talk about it. It's even more clever, it seems. So if you could talk about it.
Well, what Russell pointed out was that this whole notion of membership of a set is problematic, because when you say that a set is essentially a collection of things, and things can be members of a set. So if you say set of dogs, all the dogs are members of that set. But that set itself is not a dog. So you can take all those sets, which are now the set of dogs is not itself a dog. So it is not a member of itself. It's not a dog, right? So it's not a member of itself. So you can take all those sets which are not members of themselves, and I can make a set and say this set, the condition of its membership is that it contains all those sets which are not members of themselves. And so then of this we can ask the question, is this set a member of itself or not?
Yes.
And so then you can say that, well, if it is a member of itself, it is not a member of itself. And if it is not a member of itself, it is a member of itself. And that's a contradiction. And so Frege was devastated by this, because he had been working for 30-40 years and everything is complete, everything is ready, mathematics has been founded, and then it is just suddenly is in ruins. And so, but he wrote back to Frege saying that the way you derive the contradiction, it can be done in a better way in my system. So he wrote something like that and sent it back to Frege. To Russell.
I'm sorry, I did not follow the very last bit. Was it Frege who then said that there is a way to reconcile this contradiction? Something like that?
I think, yeah, there is some historical work on this. No, what he said was that the way you brought out the contradiction can be laid out in a better way like this. So he did not reject what Russell was saying. He said that the way to bring out the contradiction, it can be shown in my system in this manner.
I see.
So, I mean, Frege is that's why Russell said that he knew many philosophers, but very few philosophers had come up to the love of truth that Frege had. That nobody loved truth so deeply as Frege did.
And yet it is interesting that he did not, I mean, even in thought, the article, he does not seem to give a definition or any sort of description of truth, does he?
That's right, because he just thinks truth is unanalyzable.
Yes. So it's very interesting that he loves truth so much, but he's also oblivious to it, but he loves it so much.
He's not oblivious to it. He just thinks that when you define
the being
truth,
of it, let's just say,
yeah,
the being
yeah,
of truth,
yeah.
he's oblivious to that.
Yeah, that's right.
But
Frege's conception of truth is a perennially confusing issue because, in a sense, it seems very obvious. He just says that look, truth is unanalyzable. I cannot define truth in any way. So therefore, it is a very unusual thing. I can't define it, but it is absolutely central. So it's maybe some kind of theory of truth. Sometimes people call it a redundancy theory of truth, but I don't think that's the case. Some people take it as a deflationary theory of truth. The truth is not a property of anything, but Frege did think that truth was actually something out there. So it's very hard to characterize Frege's theory of truth. But he's amongst the philosophers who tend to think that truth is a simple, unanalyzable kind of concept. Something like Moore says that good is simple and unanalyzable. So in the same sense, Frege thinks truth is a simple, unanalyzable kind of idea. It is just something that's there. I just understand it, but I can't explain what it means. I can give you illustrations of it, but I can't explain what it means beyond a certain point. I definitely cannot give a definition.
So we talked about Russell's contradiction. So yes. Now it seems to me, and you might agree, that Gödel's incompleteness theorem, let's not talk about it in detail, but the essence of it, it seems it's very similar, almost as if there is a horizon in reason itself, and it seems the same from all points of view. So if I'm standing on a very tall building and I look at a horizon 36 degree north or something, and then in northeast, the horizon is the same, right? It has the same view. And so Gödel's incompleteness theorem and the essence of it, what it tries to prove, create a self-referential system in mathematics itself, and then ultimately make us conclude that certain statements in any mathematical system will always remain unprovable. This is the ultimate conclusion, right? Seems very similar to Russell's contradiction as well. So do you think there's some sort of some common thing, something similar going on, something which we can identify as a singular thing here in all of these in all of this business?
What we can identify is the standard thing that once Frege's program begins, that he wants to give a foundation to mathematics. Giving a foundation to mathematics essentially means that whatever the foundation is, once I start with it, I need a set of axioms. And so I need a finite set of axioms. So let's say 5, 10, 15, whatever. I have these axioms, and the whole of mathematics can be reduced to these axioms. Maybe these axioms are just axioms of logic. So we reduce everything to these axioms. So the point of Russell's contradiction essentially shows that there's some fault in Frege's system, but it doesn't show that the project itself is wrong. The idea of founding mathematics on a set of axioms which are logical, or any other sort of axioms, that in itself is not wrong. It's just that Frege's method has employed a particular notion of a set, and that notion is wrong. But that doesn't mean that everything else is wrong, that the entire project is wrong. What Gödel showed was that there is something wrong with this entire project of giving a foundation to mathematics, reducing them to a set of axioms. He says that it doesn't matter how many sets of axioms you have. It doesn't matter, you can have 40, 50, 100, 2000. It doesn't matter how many sets of axioms you have. You can never reduce all of mathematics to that set of axioms. Because there will always be a particular theorem in mathematics which will say of itself that I am not provable within the system. So that's what he showed. Exactly what now, there is an interesting issue as to what this really means. Okay, within mathematics I can understand what it means. It means something like I can never have an axiomatic system which will produce every single theorem of mathematics, and it will not entail that there is any theorem which is not provable. So this kind of system is impossible to get in mathematics. But there are other people who have drawn this, and Gödel himself seems to have drawn the conclusion from this that therefore mathematics is it essentially refers to a Platonic realm, because inherently it doesn't matter how many times I axiomatize it, it doesn't matter how many axioms you employ, we can never really capture the entire reality of mathematics. And that seems to suggest that mathematics is something objective and real. It is not something that I can simply reduce to a structure of symbols. So what Gödel killed was what is called the formalist project. The formalist project was that you reduce all of mathematics to this symbolic activity essentially. I give every symbol a particular meaning, and then I can give any meaning I wish, and it can be any symbol you wish, and then derive the entire of mathematics from this formal activity. So it seems as if Gödel suggests that this formal activity is not possible. That mathematics therefore is not a mere formalism, it is actually something objective. This is something Frege would very much agree with. Frege was very insistent that mathematics is objective, and if you read him, he continuously complains about formalism. So there is actually a deep link between Frege and Gödel, though they may be completely different coming to the foundations of mathematics. Frege thinks there is a foundation, Gödel thinks that well, you can't have a set of finite axioms with which you can give a foundation to mathematics. So there is, but the link comes in all the intense deep belief in objectivity. So Gödel kills the formalist project, but he does not necessarily kill the Fregean project. So far as the objectivity of mathematics is concerned, Frege is very deeply embedded in that project of objectivity of mathematics.
So it is very interesting. You say that Frege was against the formalist project, yes?
Yes, that's right.
But the formalist project was the project which wanted to reduce mathematics to logic? No?
I wouldn't say logic. It wanted
but a certain
to
set of
show
axioms
that mathematics was essentially about writing out certain symbols on paper or on the board, giving certain meanings to those symbols, or you give certain rules. You say if you take the symbol 2 as written in somewhere, and you give a particular meaning to the notion of plus that you write on the board, that's a particular symbol. I give a certain rule to it, and so by citing all these rules for all these mechanical symbols that I am using, I can generate the entire, I can make some sense of the mathematical activity. But there is really nothing else beyond this. It's not like there is a reality which the mathematicians are describing. Nothing like this is there. There are just certain rules that I am following with certain symbols in mind. That's all, finished. Nothing is there. It's not like I have I say 1 plus 1 is 2. This does not represent some fact in the world. But Frege apparently thinks that it does represent some fact in the world. And Gödel appears to think that yes, mathematical truths are actually tracking something in the world. They are actually out there. Gödel is a realist regarding mathematical entities. He is a Platonist. Whether Frege is a Platonist or not, there is a lot of debate about it, but it seems as if he at least thinks mathematical entities are objective. But Gödel also thinks that mathematical entities are objective, but the formalists don't necessarily think so. There has been very recent work on this about Frege's relationship to the formalists, and people have said that Frege borrowed many things from the formalists, and he did not necessarily feel contempt for them. He seems to think that there is some element of agreement that one can have with formalists, but on the objectivity question, he is very determined that formalists are just wrong about this. But he kind of likes the idea that what that formalists have, that you have all this set of rules, you give this particular meaning to the symbol, and then you sort of figure out what you can derive from those meanings. It's just that Frege thinks when you set the rule and when you give the meaning to the symbol, it's not arbitrary. But he says that formalist systems can never stop the charge of being arbitrary. When you give the symbol plus a particular meaning, why is it not arbitrary? That answer he thinks the formalists don't have. But the people who think that mathematics is objective, they have an answer to that question. But this relationship of Frege to the formalists is being investigated more and more nowadays. I saw some very recent articles there's a very good journal called the Journal of the History of Analytic Philosophy. So that's a very good journal. So one should take a look at it, because there are some very decent articles on that regarding Frege's relation to the formalists.
So you mentioned Frege and his idea of mathematics should be a representation of a fact in some way, or at least picturing a fact of some sort. Right? I
would say he doesn't say picturing a fact. He simply thinks that mathematical terms represent something objective. So when I say one, the word one represents something objective.
The reason
there is some entity like this.
The reason I use the word picturing is because, I mean, when you framed it that way, it seemed very close to Wittgenstein. I mean, I was about to come to him anyway, but it seemed very close to his picture theory of meaning. Yes, that is what it is called. So I suppose because this is the only thing that is left to be discussed, might as well come to this. I read a bit of this introduction, and there is one or two things which I was not quite clear about. I wanted to know what you think of it. So here Russell wrote the introduction to the Tractatus, and he writes, in order to understand Mr. Wittgenstein's book, it is necessary to realize what is the problem with which he is concerned, right? And he says, he then goes on to write, there are various problems as regards language, right? So, alright, there are a number of problems, and then he lists out 4 of them. Now, the 4th one is interesting because that is also the one which Wittgenstein is concerned with, so to say. He writes, Russell, fourthly, there is the question, what relation must one fact, and then it's written here such as a sentence. So, apparently, a fact is still linguistic, right? It is linguistic in nature.
No, not really.
So, what would be an example of a non-linguistic fact?
Well, if I say that we are, or that you are interviewing me, that's just a fact. Or maybe, well, alright, this is a very artificial kind of fact. So, if I say the earth goes around the sun, that's a non-linguistic fact, it has nothing to do with language. It has nothing to do with language. The earth went around the sun, whether human beings existed, languages exist, doesn't matter. Just the earth is just going around the sun, it's a fact.
But I suppose the entire enterprise is how to justify this connection, isn't it? I mean, how is someone saying this, the earth goes around the sun, and that is supposed to have some correspondence, correlation, whatever you call it, with reality. When I could also say, no, the earth does not go around the sun. The earth in fact goes, according to these and these equations, around the universe, because really it's not going around the sun, it's also moving in space at the same time in interstellar space and whatnot, and it is also affected by the gravitational waves of the other celestial bodies, all across the universe. So in some way then it is false to say that the earth goes around the sun. It's not a matter of fact. In fact, just for a moment to come back to Frege, he writes, I think you also mentioned it in one of your classes, or maybe it was when we were talking, that Frege writes in the article, Thought itself, the sun rises from the east. This is a true statement. But how exactly is it true? Now, I do not know how you would inquire into this, but what I made of this was that, well, it is not the case, scientifically speaking, that the sun just comes up from the east, right? The sun is the one rising. That is not the case. And yet we say it is true. So, again, to come back to Wittgenstein, again, isn't the whole enterprise to justify this? I mean, you talk of it as if we are already taking it for granted.
So I guess I won't use the word justify. What way to get to answer what you are saying, if there is any answer to it? We can just sort of understand what's going on. We need to figure out why people do philosophy of language. So this is a book, Tractatus Logico-Philosophica. It's a book in philosophical logic, and which is very close to philosophy of language. So why do people do philosophy of language? Now there are very different reasons for doing it. Okay, so the reason why someone does it today is very different from the reason why Wittgenstein did it. So Wittgenstein's idea is, how is it possible for a human being to say anything about the world? How is this possible? I say the earth is going around the sun. Well, alright, this means something to you. So how is it possible that this noise that I made means anything at all? How can these noises that we make, it's just some noise that I'm making, how can it mean anything? So ultimately he says that, well, language is related to reality, the sentences are themselves reducible to elementary propositions. The elementary proposition consists of these very fundamental objects, and every one of these objects, the linguistic objects, one would say, corresponds to the simple objects in the world, and therefore we sort of come to reflect a fact. So there are these elementary propositions, and then every sentence is reducible to a set of elementary propositions. And then these elementary propositions ultimately reflect the elementary fact of the main fact that the earth is going around the sun. So it's a kind of the reason why you're able to say anything about the world is because your thoughts are a picture of reality. So we picture reality when we say things. I should say, by the way, just before we go on, that Frege thought that mathematics was objective by nature, but Wittgenstein does not think so. He thinks that mathematical statements say nothing. So his whole point is that there are certain statements which say something. Why? They picture reality. But when we say 2 plus 2 is 4, it says nothing. Why? Because it's just a tautology, nothing else. The tautologies don't say anything. So in that sense, he's profoundly and deeply in disagreement with Frege. So however much he admires Frege and he borrows so much from Frege, but he's very deeply in disagreement with Frege so far as the objectivity of mathematics is concerned. It is objective in some sense that all of mathematics is just simply tautological. So it is always true in some sense. But there is this difference between Frege and Wittgenstein regarding the objectivity of mathematics, in the sense that are there really such Platonic entities roaming around? No, that's not the case for Wittgenstein. For Frege, it's a kind of debatable issue whether he is a Platonist or not. But to go back to this whole project of philosophy of language, that's what is really happening when he says the world is all that is the case. He says the world is basically made up of facts, not of things. These facts are essentially reported by my thoughts when I think about the world.
So this would be the first proposition and the sub-proposition to the first proposition, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So it's like right at the start he declares this.
The world is all that is the case, and the world is made up of facts and not of things, and so on. So that's the way he starts the book. Indeed, by the way, the initial half of the book was written after he had written the other parts of the book. So he gave his metaphysical stuff at the beginning of the book, and then but it came at the end. He had written the other parts of the book, and then the metaphysical part is slotted into position at the beginning.
I wonder, given that his proposition seems so complicated the way he has structured it, how would have he managed to do that? But interesting.
There's a lot of work about the structuring of the book actually. There's a lot of very interesting work as to how this numbering is done. Are there any problems and confusion? Lots of people have pointed out these confusions about his numbering system. Sometimes he will write 2.1, then his next number is 2.2, but when he writes 3.1, maybe the next number is 3.01. So where did the 0 come from? And so they think that, well, there must be something going on in Wittgenstein's mind. Why is he doing this? And so why does he follow such a odd sort of numbering system? So there are all kinds of ways of reconciling these apparent contradictions. But that's a fun exercise if you want to get into that kind of scholastic debate. But it's essentially a scholastic debate. So, but good stuff comes out of it sometimes. The Hacker has a very good article, I think, on the numbering system of the Tractatus. And it's an intensely interesting issue. I mean, you should read all this stuff since you're reading the Tractatus. The basic idea of Wittgenstein is answering is how is it that language makes sense? How can it be possible for a person to say something which is true? How is this even possible? How can you talk about the world unless your words are connected to the world directly? And so his whole idea is that our language pictures reality. And it's an interesting idea, but he kind of rejected this idea later in philosophical investigations. But the idea is a very seductive idea, there is no doubt about it. We all speak about the world. When we say the earth goes around the sun, there's something very important that we are speaking. So, or we say the sun is going around the earth, whatever, even if it is false, we are speaking about some picture of the world that is being transmitted from one person to another person. So, Wittgenstein gives a fairly simple account of language. It complicates matters in ethics, aesthetics, logic, mathematics, because when you say 2 plus 2 is 4, what picture are you representing? Nothing. There is no picture, there is nothing there in the world to be pictured. So, therefore, he reduces mathematics and logic to, well, he just says that they are tautologies. And for ethics and aesthetics, he says that these are transcendental, they don't fall into the world. The limits of my language are the limits of my world, and so they are beyond my language. Ethics and aesthetics are absolute, they are beyond my language.
I mean, he goes on to state that facts are all there is, right?
Yeah, that's right.
But
there are no
that is the
ethical
case-
facts.
Yes, but if that is the case, then whatever is not factual, as it were, emotions and whatever. But it seems to me he was also very, and this is just to.
He did not think that emotions are not factual. Anger is factual, yes. But or I am feeling sorrow or grief, that's factual. It is a fact. So if I say I am in grief, however difficult this picture may be, it's not a question of you can draw this picture. That's not what he's saying. What he said, it's a logical picture of the world. So it has been put into words. It's an amazing thing actually what the mind is doing. We often don't think about it at all. So if I say INA market is 15 stations from here, I'm giving a reasonably accurate picture of how to get to INA. Get off after 15 stations maybe. Maybe this is false, so you get off after 14 stations. But the point is that I'm giving you a reasonable accurate picture. So this is an amazing thing that the human mind is able to do. It's just astonishing what we can do. So, but there are certain things in which Wittgenstein says that there are no facts of ethics and aesthetics. They just kind of fall outside the world. In the same way, God is something that I cannot describe. There is no fact like this. My language faces a barrier here. So God is a transcendental object. It falls away from the world.
I think I would like to conclude, sir, by asking you, what do you think is the meaning of his last proposition?
Oh, the last proposition which says that whereof you cannot speak, thereof you should be silent.
Yes, that is. He seems almost semi-religious there, so I think that would be a good note to end on. Like, what does he exactly mean? What do you think he means by that?
Oh, I think he means something pretty straightforward. That if you look at what his aim in the book is, his aim in the book is to draw a limit to thought. So his idea is that, but how can you draw such a limit to thought? Because I have to think the unthinkable to draw the limit to thought. So the whole book is structured in such a way such that I draw a limit to thought. That is why, as he says that, if you have been able to understand my book, then you will understand that there are certain things of which you cannot speak. So if you cannot speak about certain things, you should just remain silent about it. So if somebody asks you a question about God, you remain silent. If someone asks you about why is it wrong to murder people, you remain silent. If someone asks you why is the good beautiful, you remain silent. Language cannot say anything about this. So you just remain silent. So whereof you cannot speak, thereof you should be silent. So that's it. And it seems to me that that's a fairly easy thing to understand given his project. One can complicate the matter much further by saying, well, yeah, he's being mystical, this, that, what. Yeah, that's all fine. But the mysticism is really, it lies in the idea that the mind mirrors the world. That's the mystical aspect of Wittgenstein, the early Wittgenstein.
I mean, he did seem to, it was the case, right, that when he was invited to the Vienna Circle to have discussions, he just turned their back on them.
That's true.
And he recited poetry. So it seems he was a very religious person, and there can be religious connotations.
Some people do interpret him like that. I mean, he was not religious in the sense of being a very Christian person or a Hindu person or a Buddhist kind of man, not like that. He's religious in the philosophical sense, I guess.
The mystical sense.
He sees the world as a place of wonder, and the connection between the mind and the world as a remarkable thing. And he is enthralled by it, by this connection. That's the sense of mysticism. It's a powerful sense of wonder regarding the connection of the mind with the world. So it's a kind of unusual mysticism. It is not the sort of mysticism other people speak about, as if I am in contact with an object which is outside the world. That's not the mysticism Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein's mysticism can be described as logical mysticism. It's a mysticism regarding the connection of the mind with the world through language, which is a remarkable thing, and in this connection he is lost in wonder. So in that sense he is mystical.
I think yes, logical. I like
it's
that
logical
word.
mysticism.
Logical mysticism is
It is not religious mysticism. His life is a logical life, not a religious life.
Sir, I think we have had a wonderful conversation, right? And on this note, I think, of course, at least I would love to explore this further. But on this note, we should end. It was wonderful talking to you, and if we ever get the time again, at least I don't know about Shivai, who's behind the camera, by the way, but at least I would love to once again do this with you sometime in the future. Thank you for.
I'd be happy to speak to you. It was a very short conversation, but we can have a longer one next time, I guess. Yeah.
So thank you
very much.
We hope you enjoyed that conversation. Click here to check out other interesting videos from School of Shastrartha. To subscribe, do not forget to do that. You can click here.